When you look at China, China has added 2 times the GDP of Africa in just the last 6 to 7 years, about $6 trillion in GDP. But as we talked about in the last episode, what did they trade for all of that development, financial wealth and development? They traded their health and they traded community. In China right now, the number of people who will die from a lifestyle disease is 9 out of 10. That's it. It's unimaginable. 9 out of 10 people, right? So again, I feel like Africa is in a position where, with our 3.1 trillion in GDP and 1.5 billion people, that we have the ability to help course correct some of this. We still have our health, we still have our community as a principle. But now let's break that down. So again, the second thing that I really wanted to focus on was, how do you now develop societies? There are 3 things that any society needs in order to develop. It's food, so you need agriculture, a way of actually producing what you eat. You need energy. So this is now electricity, light, heat. You need a way of actually producing, right? Energy. The last is then production. You need a means of production. You need a way of actually producing goods and services. That's now what translates into GDP. All right, so if you were to guess the amount of food that's imported in Africa, what would you guess? Just take a minute, put the number in your mind, think about it. What would you say is the amount of food that is imported in Africa? I'll give you a second. Think it's less than 50%? Less than 60%? It's higher. 85% of the food is imported in Africa. I should just end the video here. 85% of the food is imported. How is that even possible? On average, in most other countries, it's between 10 to 20%. But this is by design. And this is the point that I'm making, right? Like, this is by design. The Common Agricultural Policy was put in place at the end of World War II. The goal was actually to help Europe. Europe was struggling, right? Europe was actually suffering. The goal was to help Europe come out of World War II and get a bit of support. But remember, in 1955, most African countries were still colonized, right? So the Common Agricultural Policy, which was developed by what is now the EU, said, we will subsidize farmers in the European Union, help them as much as we can to get their costs down. We will then export the surplus to countries in Africa and force African countries to import it and to stop producing food in their countries. That's how Africa went from importing maybe 10 to 20% in the 1900s to then importing 85% of its food today. So you have a deficit. Then let's get to energy. 52 out of 54 countries import oil. 52 out of 54. Why? You have now MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, from one of the Bretton Woods institutions, and that's IFC and the World Bank, that basically supported energy projects that actually promoted more use of fossil fuels and actually declined more sustainable projects related to energy. On top of that, these countries that are importing oil, they pay to extract it. We pay to send it out. We pay to refine it. We pay to bring it back. You're just paying left and right. So we end up with an energy deficit. Okay, last. So our third leg, right? That we're trying. We have a stool, 3 legs, 2 of them are broken. Agricultural deficit, and we had an energy deficit. Now it's production. So in the 1970s, the gross world product, Africa's contribution in terms of production and manufacturing was 3%. Think for a moment, is it higher or lower today? I'll give you a minute. It's lower. 2% now. Our contribution for production and exporting goods is 2%. It went from 3% in the 1970s down to 2%. And that's our contribution to gross world product. That is the collective amount of goods and services produced in the world. That's GWP. And why? Oh, we have yet another by design program called structural adjustment programs by the World Bank. And the idea behind structural adjustment programs was that you needed to help African countries do trade better by creating trade liberalization policies and making it easier to privatize businesses and taking things away from the government to actually run and manage. And so, in doing that, it actually created the adverse effect and made it much more difficult to produce locally and made it much easier to import goods from other places. There you have it. The three things that any society fundamentally needs in order to thrive: food, energy, and a means of production. In Africa, by structural design and intentionality, these were actually created to now have deficits. And so, what happens when you have deficits, right? That means less jobs. If you have a deficit, it means you are. I love Dangote's quote. He says you're importing poverty and exporting jobs, basically. So, if you have a deficit, you have less jobs locally, you have less economic growth. You're not able to grow, right? Because people are not producing. So then your value in your local currency then drops. And so then people wonder why we have these currency challenges and volatility issues. Then you have less funds to invest in local projects and infrastructure. So now you have deficits. What do you now do? Well, you go back, and this is what's happening to those same countries, those same institutions, sorry, that are putting in these programs that are creating these deficits, and you now go and borrow money from them because you have to in order to make this work. What else can you do if you're in a deficit? So that's what these countries do. They go back to the same IFC and World Bank. They borrow money. They put in more programs. This debt comes at high interest rates. It now creates a dependency on these foreign institutions. And when you do that, you generally just have less capacity to deal with things that matter, right? Like healthcare and education. And instead, your concern becomes about servicing debt. And it doesn't work. It just perpetuates the scarcity mindset and this cycle that we're now trapped in. I don't know about you, but that's a lot. So again, we covered Africa in context and the global numbers, right? The three things any society needs, and then this deficit to debt trap. But what can we do, right? We can reduce the cost of living and learn from other movements. So I want to spend a little bit of time on the other movements, and then the next episode we'll talk about the how we can get all this done. So some of the movements that I'm inspired by, because the question then becomes, okay, so you put Africa in context, you've talked about the tech, you've given us all of this information, and we're talking about needing this collective vision, but can we do it? Right? Is it possible to change the course of humanity? Absolutely, yes. With vision, we can absolutely change the course of humanity with where we're going with technology. And some of the movements that I'm inspired by, one is the civil rights movement, right? So this was happening in the 1950s to the 1960s. You had leaders like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Marcus Garvey, championing this Pan-African movement for African people, the liberalization of them, and also anybody in a circumstance where they were being marginalized and oppressed. It took vision from these leaders to say, we see better for our people. People rallied behind them of all color, cross, creed, race, all of it, because of a vision for a better world. Then you now take the independence movement happening the same time across Africa, where these countries who were colonized, right? The scramble for Africa, where people sat at a table and literally drew on a map who they were going to take, what the names of these countries would be called. The independence movement saw leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Haile Selassie, right? People like Nelson Mandela, who said, we have the ability to get our people to be free. They had vision, And that's what it took. That's what it took, was a vision for humanity that could be better. The last one that I like to compare in this, because people don't often think about it, is Silicon Valley. The idea that innovation could be funded by operators and that technology could be used to advance the world for good and for the better. The silicon transistor that was invented in the late 1940s, 1947, I believe, is what has shaped so much of the technological advancement that we see today. And there were people who were wanting to continue to fund that innovation. All three of these actually driven from the Cold War and after effects of the Cold War, and people wanting to fund research, protect their people, right? Fight for their own. And so that is the common thread. But at the end of the day, the vision for humanity and what could be done in order to advance us as people moving forward, we've done it before. So I want to end with that we can absolutely do this, but it will take the collective vision. It is a handful of people who can have this collective vision, and then the rest of us to rally behind it. So in the next episode, I want to break down the how. How can we actually get this done? So join me back on the next one where we'll break it down. And in the meantime, check out the petition at chinyere.co. That is CHINYERE.co, where you can join and be part of the movement. See you on the next one.